The numbers didn't lie. That was the one thing Wren had always believed in. Balance sheets, ledgers, the clean finality of columns that added up. People lied, contracts lied, but numbers just sat there, patient and honest, waiting for you to catch up to what they already knew. She was staring at a spreadsheet at 11:30 on a Tuesday night when her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Just wanted you to hear it from me first. Attached was a photo, Calla and Brett, at the restaurant on Meridian where Wren had told Brett she loved him for the first time. Calla's hand was across the table, her fingers woven through his. They were laughing. It was the kind of photo you take when you want someone to see it. Wren read the message twice. Then she closed her laptop, picked up her coat, and left. She didn't cry in the elevator. She didn't cry in the parking garage. She got in her car, drove 7 blocks, and pulled into the first bar she could find that looked like nobody inside it would want to talk to her. It was called The Anchor. The sign had 2 letters burned out. She didn't know the neighborhood well. She'd moved to the city 18 months ago for the accounting firm, not for the culture, and she didn't particularly care that the parking lot had a cracked concrete apron and 0 streetlights. She cared that it was open and that the stools at the bar looked like they'd hold a person without demanding conversation. She ordered a whiskey, then another. Then she pulled out her phone, looked at the photo again, and put the phone face down on the bar. Brett had been with Calla for, she did the math automatically, the way she always did, at least 4 months, based on a text she'd seen in his phone back in February that she'd told herself meant nothing. She had a bad habit of that, deciding that what she could prove didn't count if she didn't want it to. You look like you're calculating something unpleasant. She didn't look up. I'm calculating several things. Anything I should be concerned about. Now she looked. The man sitting 2 stools down was not what she expected from the Anchor on a Tuesday night. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than her monthly rent, dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw like something that had been decided on and committed to. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old. Somewhere in the territory where a man either looked worn out or refined, and this one had landed on the latter. A scar ran through his left eyebrow, clean and old, and clearly not an accident. He was watching her with the particular attention of a person who was used to being the one who decided when conversations happened. "Not your concern," she said. "Probably not." He didn't look away. "You've been staring at your phone face down for 20 minutes. Either you're waiting for a call you're dreading, or someone sent you something you didn't want to see." She picked up her glass. "You make a habit of watching strangers. I make a habit of noticing things." A pause. Occupational necessity. She didn't ask what his occupation was. It felt somehow like a door she shouldn't open in a bar she didn't know at midnight with 2 whiskeys in her. His name, she would find out much later, was Cassian Vale. But that night he didn't offer it, and she didn't ask, and they sat 3 feet apart and talked about nothing personal. The bar's terrible lighting, the baseball game on the mute TV, whether whiskey or bourbon was the appropriate response to a Tuesday, until the bartender called last round. She stood up to leave. Her keys were in her hand when 2 men came through the door at the back. They weren't patrons. She knew it the way you know a smell before you name it. They moved wrong. Too deliberate, too coordinated, eyes going to the man at the bar before they'd even clocked the room. The man, she still didn't know his name, didn't turn around. He said very quietly, "Walk toward the back exit, turn left and keep moving. Excuse me? Those men are not here for a drink." He still hadn't moved. "I would prefer you were elsewhere when this becomes a conversation. Are you in danger?" Something shifted in his expression. Not fear, something older than fear. "No, but bystanders can be inconvenient." He glanced at her then, 1 full second of attention that felt like being measured by something extremely precise. "Go." She went. She found the back exit, turned left, and stood in an alley that smelled like rain and dumpsters, and listened to nothing she could identify. No gunshots, no shouting. 5 minutes passed. She was calculating whether to call the police, and what, exactly, she would say. When the back door opened and he walked out like he'd just stepped away from a meeting that had gone exactly as planned, he looked at her. You're still here. I was deciding whether to call 911. I'd prefer you didn't. I assumed. She put her phone away. Are you going to tell me what that was? A negotiation in a bar. At midnight, I find unusual settings keep people honest. He studied her. You're calmer than most people would be. I work in forensic accounting, she said. I spend 8 hours a day reconstructing what people did with money they weren't supposed to have. I have a high threshold for things that don't add up. Something crossed his face that might, on a different man, have been the beginning of a smile. She walked back to her car. She didn't look back. She told herself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. She found the discrepancy on a Thursday. Third-party vendor account, routed through a subsidiary of a subsidiary, structured just badly enough to look like sloppiness instead of intent. Wren had been brought in by Calder and Mott to do a routine compliance audit on a hospitality group, restaurants, 3 hotels, an event venue, that was applying for a significant line of credit. The hospitality group was called Meridian Collective. It took her 2 days to realize she recognized the name from a building she'd driven past 100 times. It took her another half-day to find the second set of records, filed under a company name that was a single letter different from the first. She flagged it to her supervisor. Her supervisor told her to finish the standard audit and leave the anomalies for the bank's own compliance team. She did not leave the anomalies. She spent the weekend cross-referencing. By Sunday evening, she had a folder with 63 pages of documentation and a very clear picture of what Meridian Collective was and was not, financially speaking. She had also, somewhere around page 40, started to feel the particular cold sensation that came when numbers stopped being interesting and started being frightening. On Monday, she got a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. Miss Holt. She knew the voice. It took her 3 seconds to place it. The bar, the Tuesday, the alley, and when she did, she sat down very carefully in her office chair. How do you know my name? You left your business card on the bar, he said. The bartender found it. She had done that. She gave out cards reflexively, the way other people said nice to meet you. That doesn't explain why you're calling. I understand you're auditing a company I have interests in. She was very still. That's a vague way to put it. It's an accurate way. A pause. I'd like to meet, to discuss what you found. Every rational instinct, she had said, end this call, report it, escalate. She knew what this was. She'd read enough case files to know what a call like this meant, that she'd gone somewhere in those 63 pages that someone did not want her to go, and that the someone had resources she didn't. I don't think that's appropriate, she said. Probably not, he agreed, which was not what she expected. But I'm not asking you to do anything inappropriate. I'm asking you to have a conversation before you do something you can't undo. She should have said no. She said, where? He named a restaurant she'd never heard of. When she looked it up, it had no reviews, no website, and an address in a part of the city where the buildings all looked like they'd decided. Privacy was more important than signage. He was already there when she arrived. The room was small, well lit. Empty except for a man standing near the door who she understood immediately was not a maitre d'. She sat across from Cassian Vale. She knew his name by then. She'd spent Sunday evening finding out what she could, and she kept her hands flat on the table so he could see she wasn't recording anything. He noticed. Of course he noticed. You know who I am, he said. I know what the public record says about who you are. Which is not very much, which itself says quite a lot. And I know that the financial structure of Meridian Collective is not the structure of a legitimate hospitality business. It's the structure of something that needs hospitality as a front. She said it plainly, the way she'd say any audit finding, because fear, she'd learned, smelled bad and invited worse behavior. I also know that the second filing I found has 4 dormant accounts with a combined balance that doesn't match any legitimate revenue source I can identify. He was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do with it? I haven't decided. That surprised him. She could tell because his expression didn't change, but the quality of his attention sharpened. Most people in your position, he said, have decided before they walk in the door. Most people in my position haven't actually read 63 pages, she said. I found something else in there. Someone else was already inside those accounts before I was, pulling numbers in a way that wasn't authorized and wasn't clumsy. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She paused. Whoever it was, they weren't auditing you. They were building leverage. The stillness around him changed. Not in any visible way. He didn't move, didn't react. But something in the room felt like a pressure dropping before a storm. "Show me," he said. She opened her laptop. They sat in that restaurant for 3 hours. She showed him what she'd found. He asked questions that were precise and intelligent, and that told her, incrementally, how well he understood his own organization. He did not threaten her. He did not flatter her. When she pointed out something he hadn't known, he wrote it down. At the end of it, he said, "The person who built that access inside my accounts works for me." "I know," she said. "Or, worked for you. The last entry is 6 weeks ago." Something moved across his face that was not an emotion she had words for. "I have a problem. You have several problems." She closed the laptop. "What does that have to do with me? I need someone who understands what you just showed me, who can follow it forward and find out where it goes." He looked at her directly. "You're good at this." "I'm excellent at this," she said. "That doesn't mean I'm available." "Name a number." She laughed, actually laughed the first time in a week. "You can't pay me to audit a criminal enterprise. That's not how any of this works. I'm not asking you to audit it. I'm asking you to find the person who's stealing from it and tell me who it is." She should have stood up and left. She knew it the way she knew when a column didn't add up, not from logic but from the part of the brain that did math before the rest caught up. "What happens to them when I find them?" she asked. "That's not your part of the ledger. It might be my part of my conscience." He looked at her for a long moment. "No permanent harm," he said, in the tone of a man making a concession he hadn't planned to make. My word. She should not have trusted that. She knew that too. I'll need full access to every account, including the ones that aren't supposed to exist. She pulled out a notepad, wrote down a number, and slid it across the table. "And I'll need that per week, plus expenses. Non-negotiable." He looked at the number. "Agreed. I want it in writing." He looked up. "Not because I think a piece of paper protects me from anything," she said, "because I don't work without documentation. It's a professional principle." The almost smile again, briefer this time. "I'll have something drawn up." She drove home that night and sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time. She was not calculating. She was just breathing. The numbers had led her somewhere she hadn't expected, and she had followed them the way she always did. Past the point where it was comfortable, all the way to where it was true. His people were cautious around her. That was the right word, cautious, not hostile. She showed up at the offices Vale used for what she'd come to think of as his legitimate scaffolding. 3 floors of a building on the west side that housed an import business, a property management company, and a security consulting firm. She was given desks in a glass-walled room and access to a server she was fairly certain had never been touched by an outside auditor. She worked. That was the thing she was best at. She didn't try to charm anyone, didn't make friends, didn't ask questions that weren't about the numbers. The man who brought her coffee the first morning, large, watchful, a tattoo at his collar, started leaving it without being asked by the 3rd day. Vale was in the building perhaps half the time. When he was, he'd stop by the glass room occasionally, not to check on her work, to ask specific questions. In the offshore routing from February, is the gap consistent or variable? The transfers that stop in March, do they stop or do they move? He had already understood the basic structure. He was tracking something she hadn't found yet. She liked that, the precision of it. She didn't like that she liked it. On the 8th day she found the name. It was embedded in the metadata of a transfer authorization that had been processed under a different employee's credentials. Sloppy, the kind of sloppiness that only happened when someone was in a hurry or felt untouchable. The name was Felix Crane. He had been Vale's chief financial officer for 4 years. She printed the documentation, took it down the hall, knocked on the door that had no sign on it. Vale looked at the papers for 90 seconds. He looked up. Are you certain? I'm certain of what the records show. I'm certain the access pattern is consistent with someone who knows the system architecture from the inside. I'm certain the timing corresponds to dates when Crane was the authorizing signatory on the legitimate side of the books. She paused. I'm as certain as numbers allow, which is more certain than most things. He was quiet for a while. You should take the afternoon off. I don't want the afternoon off. I want to know what the 4 dormant accounts were actually used for, because whoever tipped off the bank examiner on the 3rd quarter discrepancy was not doing it accidentally, and that's a separate thread from Crane. Vale looked at her with that measuring quality again, the same one from the bar, the alley, the restaurant. Like she was a number that kept coming out differently than expected, and he was deciding whether the formula was wrong or whether he'd been miscalculating something. The accounts were holding funds we were moving for a family we have an arrangement with, he said, which was the most information he'd given her voluntarily. If the examiner was tipped, we have exposure we can't close quietly. Who knew about the accounts besides Crane? 4 people. Give me access to their correspondence from the past 6 months. He gave it to her. She found the leak 2 days later. It wasn't one of the 4. It was a woman named Delia, an executive assistant who'd been in the building for 11 years, who had a brother facing federal charges in another state, and whose correspondence showed a pattern of carefully worded emails to an address she'd probably thought was untraceable. Wren brought this to Vale on a Friday afternoon. He read it standing up. He didn't speak for a long time. She has a brother, Wren said. She wasn't doing it for money. She was doing it because someone offered to make his situation better. I know. His voice was quiet and entirely without heat, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. She's been with us 11 years. What are you going to do? He looked at her. She held the look because she'd decided, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, that she wasn't going to flinch from what this actually was. She'd taken the money. She'd done the work. She didn't get to be squeamish at the results. Nothing permanent, he said. You have my word, but she'll need to leave, and we'll need to make sure she understands what silence costs. That's not a threat. It's a statement of account. He set the pages down. She'll be fine. Her brother's situation is more complicated. He looked out the window for a moment. You've done what I hired you to do. I know, the arrangement is concluded. She should have felt relieved. The clean end of a ledger, columns balanced, project closed. She gathered the papers into her folder. There's one more thread, she said. He waited. The person who recruited Delia, the contact on the other end of those emails, is not federal. The address routes back through 3 cutouts, but the writing pattern is consistent. And one of the phrases used appears in correspondence I've seen in your files. Not Delia's, not Crane's. Older. She looked at him. Whoever this is, they've been working around you for longer than 6 months. Vale said nothing. The quality of silence in the room changed. I found it because the phrasing was distinctive, she said. 3 words, used in the same construction, twice. Most people would miss it. But you don't miss things. I don't miss patterns. She held out the second folder. It's all documented. He took it. His hand was still. She noticed, not for the first time, the scar that crossed 2 knuckles, different from the one through his eyebrow, less clean, the kind that said something had been decided against his preference. Why are you giving me this? He said. The arrangement is concluded. You've been paid. You had no obligation to keep going. She had thought about how to answer this. She'd thought about it for 2 days, which was unusual. She generally processed things quickly. I started the column, she said. I don't leave columns unfinished. It has nothing to do with you. He looked at her for a long moment. I'd like to hire you again, he said. I assumed. She picked up her bag. I'll need a separate contract, separate scope. I have some conditions this time that I didn't include last time, such as access to the full structure, not just the sections you've deemed relevant. No time I'm told is fine when it isn't. And I want to know when I find something, what you're going to do with it before you do it. She paused. Not because I expect veto power, because I don't work in the dark. He studied her. You're asking me to be accountable to my own accountant. I'm asking you to treat the ledger honestly, she said. You told me in the restaurant that numbers don't lie. You were right. I'd like to work in an environment that reflects that. He picked up a pen from his desk, wrote something on a notepad, tore it off, handed it to her, a number higher than her ask from 2 weeks ago, much higher. She looked at it, looked at him. You're not paying me to find things, she said. You're paying me to stay. Yes. She should have said she needed to think about it. She should have said she'd be in touch. She should have said any number of things that would have put 24 hours and some sleep between her and this room. She said, I'll need the contract by Monday. She didn't tell her sister. She didn't tell anyone, because there wasn't anyone she was close enough to tell, and because there were no words for it that would have made sense outside the 2 weeks she'd just lived. She went back to her apartment that weekend and cooked dinner and ran the numbers in her head, not Vale's numbers, just hers. Her bank balance, her overhead, the amount she'd been paid against the risk she'd accepted, the likelihood that this arrangement would remain what it appeared to be versus the probability that it would become something she hadn't accounted for. The thing about probabilities was that it could tell you a range of outcomes. It couldn't tell you which one you'd actually land in. She thought about him, and she was honest with herself about that, the way she was honest about everything that could be counted, the way he asked questions, the way he'd said no permanent harm like it cost him something to commit to it, the way, when she'd handed him the second folder, he'd gone very still in the particular way of someone absorbing new information rather than performing a reaction to it. She didn't dress it up. She didn't tell herself it was professional admiration or intellectual curiosity. She'd been doing books long enough to know when something wasn't balancing out to what she was calling it. Monday morning she signed the contract. The scope was broader. The conditions she'd named were in writing. His signature was precise and economical, the signature of a man who didn't waste motion. His assistant, a woman named Tara who had so far said 8 words to Wren and clearly intended to keep the number low, brought her coffee as Wren settled in at the desk that had, without anyone announcing it, become hers. She opened the first file. Outside the glass wall, the office moved and functioned and processed the ordinary business of a structure that was built on things that didn't fully appear in any ledger she'd ever touched. She understood that. She understood, with the particular clarity that 2 weeks of 63-page documentation tends to produce, had exactly what this was and what she was doing inside it. She thought about Brett, which she'd barely done in 2 weeks. The photo, Calla's hand across the table, the restaurant on Meridian. She thought about the bar with the 2 burned-out letters in the sign, and a man in an expensive jacket who'd told her to leave before things got complicated, and how she'd stood in the alley anyway, because she'd wanted to know what came next. She turned the page. The numbers were already talking. She just had to listen.